Many of you have seen me in my travels around, both in vivo and via Zoom and so on, providing training on behalf of UKRIO for universities, for ethics committees, for chairs, and of course for researchers. So moving on, a quick plug for this document, which James mentioned at the beginning, for a couple of reasons really. This document has given rise to several issues which have been identified through the training. Obviously, the document itself is only fairly recently published, but John was the lead author and I was one of the other authors, and it certainly informs the work I've been doing as I've been delivering the teaching. There is another good reason for putting it up as well, and that is because I failed to put any references on my presentation, but actually the references are largely in there. So hopefully I can be forgiven for not putting the references on the presentation. From the time when I first set out an abstract for this presentation, things moved a bit, and John and I managed to coordinate so that we're going to give complementary presentations, which means some slight changes, not to broad content, but to emphasis in terms of my original abstract. I will still certainly be looking at COVID research and the lessons that can be learned as far as research ethics is concerned. And I will certainly be looking at some of these issues that have arisen as I've been teaching. In the background will be the issue of how virtue ethics is particularly helpful for ethics committees in their deliberations, and of course particularly helpful for researchers. But the major theory behind virtue ethics, John's going to cover in the next presentation. So all will be there, but with perhaps just slightly different emphases. So what lessons can we learn from COVID research as far as research ethics is concerned? Well, I've been involved in most of these. I've actually led the ethics review on the Oxford vaccine study, and I've been involved in various other clinical trials and immunological studies. My experience these days is not closely related to the sort of work that's gone on in universities. But I just really want to pick out a few key big issues here. Clinical trials, well, all of them have posed several really very significant issues. Not least the reappropriation. I think reappropriation is probably best said rather than potential misappropriation of drugs that have long been in use, but being used in the context of clinical trials. These are rapidly produced trials, perhaps not always with the same rigor as we're used to. And I think they've challenged clinicians particularly, let alone ethics committees, because it's been fairly clear from the outset that all of the drugs that are being tested are not of the same weighting. The equipoise that everybody hopes for is really only just about present. So there's a big ethical issue for a start. Vaccine studies are, in the main, fairly straightforward, though obviously there are big issues as far as safety is concerned. But as you well know, the Oxford vaccine study has recently reported in The Lancet with very good safety outcomes. It's now proceeding into the next stage, into effectively a phase 3 stage. The biggest challenge for just about all of the clinical studies, as far as COVID is concerned at the moment, is the rapidly dwindling number of potential participants, to the extent where on occasion I've been asked to make, I suppose, an ethical judgment about who should have first bag on the very few potential participants, particularly those who are most seriously ill. So again, a different sort of challenge for ethics committees and so on. Massive growth of databases and continuing confusion really about those boundaries between confidentiality and the public good as far as use of data are concerned. Quite clearly, in a pandemic such as we're facing now, or were facing more strongly earlier on, there is always going to be a tension between protecting the privacy of individuals and actually making enough data available to learn important lessons about the virus itself. Ethics committees have had to contend with very hastily prepared documents, and here I praise the HRA. Its rapid response to requests for review have been incredibly good. And I'll also praise the MHRA as well. I mean, in a lot of cases, research, ethics review and approval, including MHRA review and so on, has been turned around in not much more than 24 hours. I think maybe university ethics committees could learn a lot from that. If the HRA can do it, perhaps we could spread that more widely. There have been massive changes in relation to provision of information and consent. Many more examples of remote consent using software which seems to me to be entirely satisfactory and might be applied more broadly. The blurred boundaries of confidentiality, that's really what I was picking up when I mentioned databases earlier on. Another challenge for ethics committees, I think, has been adjustments to trials and studies that were running pre-COVID. Some of those have been hastily done. I don't think it's always wise to take what was maybe previously individual interviews and turn them into Zoom interviews and things like that. I think there's a real danger that new ethics issues occur and also studies become compromised as a result of those sorts of changes. And of course, there's been ethically challenging lots of opportunism. I've certainly been asked on numerous occasions if I add a few questions about COVID to my questionnaire, is it likely to gain a quicker approval through the system? Is it more likely to find favour and so on? So there's been a fair bit of opportunism, which I think is a challenge for ethics committees and a challenge for research ethics. So when I look now at some of the key themes that I've picked up during the training, the first one, the role of RECs. And I think it's fair to say, given the speed that is now required, but given the proper role of RECs anyway, surely the role of RECs is to focus most particularly and most strongly on ethics. One of the things I've picked up is that universities, some universities, are tending to use their RECs for much wider governance issues. So they're expecting RECs to deal with things like GDPR and other legal compliance and so on, rather than focusing on the business of ethics. Given all the pressures, we now really have to focus on the business of ethics. And that raises this broader issue of the scope of ethics review. Ethics committees are there to review ethics of the various studies. They're not there to undertake legal review. They're not really there to look at methodology, though of course extreme examples of poor methodology in themselves raise questions about the ethics of any particular study. So it never quite disappears, but it shouldn't be right at the fore. I suppose my plea is to say the role of ethics committees is broadly to support, to facilitate ethical research. And I think one of the big themes I've picked up in the training is the issue that all too often RECs are seen as obstructions to research. We can't afford for that to happen. Researchers already face enough difficulties with competition and various other problems. The last thing they want is to see RECs as a further obstruction. or worse still, some sort of hurdle. The big message that I've tried to get through, and I think it's an important message to carry on, is that ethics must be there as a key consideration throughout the life course of research, from design all the way through to dissemination, and RECs should be there to try and support. So RECs are not there to be a regulatory hurdle or a compliance check. Fairly shortly, I go on to look at some examples of compliance and the difficulties around it. The big one that I see is RECs spending their time comparing a researcher's efforts to, for example, university templates for things like information sheets and so on. And I'll use that as a specific example because I think it's an important one. So what should RECs look for? Ethics. And how can they focus that? Well, as I say, I'll give just a couple of slides on virtue ethics because I think that's the best way forward, particularly in COVID research, and I'll leave it for John to cover the theory. You obviously will have a copy of these slides afterwards, but look down that middle bold column. What are RECs looking for? They're looking for courageous researchers, not ones that are timid and just follow through replications and so on. Groundbreaking research. We would want to commend that ethically. But out of that list in the middle, people often ask me what's most important, and I would say respectfulness. Ethics committees need to look for evidence that researchers are respectful of their participants. They show compassion. They show real concern and real care. I won't go through the rest of that list, but you can see exactly what I mean there. Ethics committees themselves should be virtuous in the way they undertake their reviews. Here I've used, I developed this work myself. It's actually in the Emerald series. John's got an image of that particular text. But working your way through phases of review, from understanding to reflecting, and one should also expect the ethics committee to demonstrate virtue. Again, if you look through that middle column, you can see various examples of virtues that ethics committees should be demonstrating. What I haven't got on that list, which has come to light the more I think about this, and perhaps in my next iteration of this particular idea, I'll add it. The biggest thing that ethics committees need to do, in my view, is to learn to trust researchers. Particularly in these pressured times, we should not start from a position of distrust. We should start from a position of trust. Because after all, researchers don't set out to undertake unethical research. They set out to progress with ethical research. So trust is probably, well, it is all important. Now, I'll try and apply this in the couple of minutes I've got left. It has enormous implications for information and consent. I'm not going to go through this in detail because it is the topic of the next webinar. But needless to say, there's been huge problems with issues of COVID patients and their capacity to consent to participate in research. Another really important thing has been how to deliver information in order to support consent. It's been really exciting to see an increasing move away from the ubiquitous information sheet to more exciting and more accessible formats, pictorial formats, use of videos, use of apps. If you are seriously ill with COVID, then really you're not in the right place to read a long information sheet. So more and more, I think, needs to be delivered verbally, but also take advantage of other media. Now, one of the things that really hits me, and most of you, I guess, who are associated with universities have templates for information sheets. You are being invited to take part in a research study. I can't quite find the origins of this. It came originally from the NHS, but in terms of who actually scribed this in the first place, imagine yourself in hospital, imagine yourself being invited to participate in research, and this is presented to you. It seems to me wholly uncaring, thoughtless, and lacking in any sort of ethical consideration. Think about an alternative. Whoops, I managed to go back one. Yeah, so here's the opening of a respectful PIS. We are sorry that you've been admitted to hospital with a diagnosis of COVID-19 and so on. Isn't that a more ethical way to invite people to participate in research? And this draws directly from this idea of the key virtue that researchers should show is respect for participants. Similarly, consent forms. Again, the templates abound. Has it ever occurred to anybody out there that really you only need that first clause? That the person's read the information sheet, they've had the chance to ask the questions, they understand what's in it. If you've got comprehensive information, why do you need another dozen clauses on an information sheet? I would say immediately it's unnecessary. And also notice this other one, again, it's almost standard, you know, free to withdraw at any time. Really? You know, in most cases, the opportunities to withdraw are very limited, and that needs to be spelled out in the information. Moving on, that tension between ethics and GDPR, I'm still seeing constant confusion. Interestingly, as far as ethics is concerned, it's worth noting that, that the Secretary of State has lifted the normal restrictions on access to confidential patient information in order to support not just research in COVID, but also in terms of surveillance and wider public health issues. Normally, consent would be required. That should be contrasted with GDPR, which is all about the processing of personal data, which can, of course, include confidential medical information, but it's rather wider. Consent is not required to process personal data, rather assurance that it will only be used for tasks in the public interest. There's still lots of confusion out there. Obviously, I can't go on any further to add clarification, but happily pick up questions. And finally, I think we're missing a trick with naturalistic research. More and more raves are creeping in. I think it's likely that more and more protests are creeping in. What a wonderful opportunity to collect some data and put it to research use. It will be very difficult to continue to conduct research with structured trials. We are missing opportunities to collect data in natural circumstances. That's where I'll stop. I hope that's okay. Thank you all very much for listening. And I think I've only gone 2 or 3 minutes past my 15 minutes, so I think that's not too bad. Okay, I'll stop there and pick up any questions that anybody has.
David, that was brilliant. Thank you very much. We've had a couple of questions already. First, Heidi asked, is it possible to provide the link to the online consent software mentioned? If that's something you can share with us, we can share with participants afterwards. We also had a question from Roger, who, when you talk about virtue ethics and sort of character, he went, surely what is most important is the act, not the character.
Well, really, one informs the other. Where does the act come from, other than a person, I would say, who primarily is virtuous? Now, I think it's very difficult to separate those two things. John will say a bit more, but the idea, of course, is not that anybody is automatically virtuous. It's about continuously practicing. So it's a constant case of acting and reflecting. That constant articulation of acting and reflecting on one's acts is is the source for growing virtue. So I don't think they're easily separated, and I think it's a perfectly legitimate question.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, I've got a couple more questions. I should say, everyone, we've got around 15 minutes for Q&A, so please do ask your questions. We'll have plenty of time to go through them. Okay, next question was from Richard. How does David envisage ethical review occurring for naturalistic opportunistic research, such as with the raves? Would it be post hoc, and if so, would that set a dangerous precedent?
Well, in terms of encouraging them, I mean, I don't think there's anything a researcher is going to do to encourage or discourage raves. These are going to happen. What I'd love to see is a university or a group of researchers or a group of universities with an interest in this, who have almost a task force to, I mean, obviously it would take support and cooperation from the police as well, but to take advantage of actually launching into a naturalistic surrounding, gaining as much data as possible. I'm sure that in those circumstances, participants in raves and so on, if you can call them participants, would actually wish to make a positive contribution. I think they're already making their views known in other ways, but what about taking advantage of that? So perhaps some sort of task force, or perhaps some opportunity, perhaps liaison with the police. It could be post hoc, because it would be possible. I'm sure the police do collect some names and addresses. I'm sure with minimal cooperation, it would be possible to pass on data like that. I mean, it's whimsical in many ways, but what a missed opportunity if we don't find an ethical and practical way round actually examining these things. I mean, the thing that interests me at the moment, of course, is that what we're worried about, as far as COVID is concerned, is increasing numbers of positive tests. That's the data that's being collected. Nobody's collecting the most, well, nobody's advertising the most important data, as far as I'm concerned, which would be increased hospitalizations. What I'm getting at is we don't know much about transmission. We don't know much about asymptomatic transmission and so on. We need to learn a lot more. Now, if you try and design a trial to find out more about that sort of thing, it's going to be really hard. If you leap into a natural situation, the chances are that it would be perfectly possible to find out really interesting and important things.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, two related questions. Firstly, Fiona asked what issues have emerged from the use of Zoom to replace face-to-face interviews. And secondly, Emma asked, is there any guidance for taking consent over the phone? For example, do you need a second person to act as a witness to the conversation, or do you need to record the conversation? So issues involving Zoom and taking consent via phone, or perhaps via other virtual means.
Zoom for interviews, it can be fine. And you know, there's no question about it, but it has to be said, if it was the right approach, it would have been the approach which was adopted at the outset. And there are plenty of examples of research which does use video links and so on in terms of conducting interviews. The biggest ethical problem is that there's nothing much you can do if you're engaged with somebody on Zoom and they become distressed, or it becomes obvious that they're in need of care or whatever, you know, and people are missing that. It's very different to an interview face-to-face, which will often be in a clinical facility or some other facility where support is on hand. So I think that is highly problematic. I mean, in terms of witnessing consent and things like that, you know, I think in many ways consent is overdone in terms of recording it. A record has to be taken, but it doesn't have to mean any sort of signed consent form, and it certainly doesn't have to go as far as being witnessed. But the researcher at least needs a very clear log, at the very least, to say that that consent was freely given. There are ways of actually recording consent, because a telephone interview is likely to be recorded well, why not, as part of the recording, record the person's consent to continuing to participate in the telephone interview? So there are different approaches to consent where they can be audio recorded, transcribed along with the rest of the interview and so on. And that, for me, is probably more persuasive evidence than a signature on a consent form. There is one other thing I'll say about Zoom, and that is the use of Zoom to conduct ethics committee meetings. I've had loads of experience of that now. It works particularly well for one important respect. It's meant that since we introduced it in the HRA, all researchers have been able to attend the meeting of the ethics committee from, in many cases, from far-flung places. Now, I think universities could do a lot to involve researchers more in terms of participating in a discussion at the ethics committee. Zoom is a very easy way of introducing that, or universities use other software as well, of course. But what an interesting way to expand proper dialogue in terms of analysing ethics issues in research.
These are me myself. Thank you. Okay, actually three questions about behaviour of ethics committees. They're all related. Firstly, from an anonymous attendee, you mentioned ethics panels tends to distrust researchers from the onset, but wish they started off with trust. Why do you think the case is that panels often distrust researchers? And the second question's from Ned and Sarah. There's obviously pressure on university recs to extend their remit into GDPR and governance and compliance with templates. How could, what are arguments that could be applied to sort of push back against that behaviour, either behaviour by the recs or pressure on recs from institutions to do this? So about trust in research and about the shift of rec remits into GDPR and how to counteract that.
Well, why the mistrust? If you look at most training materials for research ethics, and I even touch on this a tiny bit myself, the history is one of Nazi Germany and all the nasty things you could ever imagine. So, there is this, there's almost been built up over the years a sort of participant protection model, which says that ethics committees are there to protect participants from big bad research. There is also, I think, a culture which is being built up, which is to look at applications and almost start from the position of what's wrong with this. And if you look at feedback from most ethics committees, it tends to be a list of things that the ethics committee has found to dispute. It's very rare that you see an ethics committee getting back to a researcher and saying, that was a very nice way to approach participants. It is, the whole culture needs to be rethought. In most cases, it's very rare that you find an application for review which doesn't have some positive points, which doesn't reflect something which would at least lead to reviewers to the committee having ground to fundamentally trust the researcher. So it's a big cultural shift, but it's one that I think needs to be tackled. On the issue of universities pushing governance decisions towards ethics committees, I think there's a very simple answer to this. Universities just need to be reminded about what logo is at the top of all of the research, all the study materials and everything else. What organisation actually sponsors the research, in other words, is legally responsible for the proper conduct of the research, and what organisation actually gives approval. It is the university. Universities are being very foolish if they think they can pass those sorts of responsibilities to an ethics committee. All an ethics committee can do is to give an ethics opinion of the research. And it's a very important role in the overall scheme of governance, but I would say no more important than other aspects of governance and other aspects of integrity. So it's a case of universities, I think, being reminded who is really carrying the can. Ethics committees don't have legal experts. They're not responsible for resources and all of the other really important things that underpin an approval as opposed to an ethics opinion.
Thank you. A question from Rachel on that same issue. If the result of something like a data breach is harm to the research participant, then can consideration of data management, or within that linking to GDPR or other governance issues, can those issues be truly removed from ethical review when recs often try to weigh up risk-benefit balance?
There are always issues of risk-benefit balance, I know. But at the end of the day, the proper management of data and GDPR is a matter for the organisation. So any breaches that happen to occur are to do, as far as I'm concerned, not with anything that the ethics committee has picked up or not picked up. It's to do with the organisation and the management and the way that organisation processes data. This is why the transparency statements are so important. This is why it's so important that participants do have links to the appropriate information office within university. I don't think there is an issue really for ethics committees to tackle on this. It could and perhaps should be reviewed entirely separately. My only sadness is that the ubiquitous information sheet, awful though it already is, in many cases is now cluttered up with a whole load of stuff about GDPR, where actually a link would probably be far more appropriate. I mean, the information should be available to participants, but it's not really an ethics issue. I think what the ethics committee needs to think about is the ethics side of information, which is about confidentiality, and preserving it where it is offered or showing where the limitations are, and privacy. And in both of those cases, consent will be required, which is very different to GDPR.
Thank you. Okay, I think we'll have time for a couple more questions. Damien asked about problems with moving interviews online. I think we've covered that issue already, but we can always follow up. Okay, we've had two questions for you about how recs work. Dale agreed that recs ought to trust more. The tone in which recs respond is very important, and researchers should feel trusted. But how reassured might participants be by approach that more strongly emphasises trust? Is it not the recs' role to ensure we have robust processes in place to ensure that research is ethical rather than relying on trust? Can we have some examples of how trust can be brought into the system? And finally, from Anne, many recs have moved from reviewing at meetings to do reviewing with other online systems. So the interactions with the applicants are necessarily different. What are the issues raised by these newer models? The HRA model is now not the only one, and do you feel whether this has changed the role of committees?
Okay, so on the trust issue, I think participants would be much more reassured if it were to be the case that the ethics committee was involved with the researcher from the very earliest stages. And I can tell you, in my own experience, I get lots of this, and this is say even because most people wouldn't imagine it, but in the context of the NHS, I get lots of researchers who contact me and say, we're designing this study, we want it to be designed ethically from the beginning. Now, if participants knew that there was ethics expertise involved from the design all the way through, I would hope that they'd be really reassured. And I've done similar work in universities. I've been an on-board ethics advisor to research teams, sometimes with huge funding and so on. And that's provided the reassurance not only to the funders, but also to participants to say, ethics wasn't a last-minute consideration. That's the big message. We need to move away from this idea that we've done everything else, now we need ethics. Because if you take that approach, then I think that there's every good reason for participants to be concerned. If on the other hand, you say that this team of researchers has worked to design this study ethically from the very beginning and has involved ethics expertise from the very beginning, and continues to evolve that expertise as the study progresses. So we need a very different approach to this last minute final hurdle approach. And, you know, I can say it is growing outside well, it's growing generally, but lots more energy is needed for that. In terms of different systems, yeah, it's great to see new systems developing, but there is a risk that some of the online, well, no, let me make it clear. Some of the online approaches are very helpful where there are very limited ethics issues and sometimes none at all. So the sort of checklisting which allows researchers to more or less self-review, and for those data to be collected centrally, so there is a record, that makes perfect sense. Who wants to waste the time of an ethics committee looking at studies where there are no ethics issues? So that is good. I do get a bit concerned that that there is a growth of more and more criterial review, which is more and more digital, when actually some sort of interaction is really needed between the ethics committee and the researcher. So I appreciate we can't actually, you know, no university could possibly ethically review every study. So proportionality, get rid of those that really don't involve any ethics issues. You know, actually have perhaps an expedited or subcommittee approach to some that really have more minimal ethics issues, but make sure that the standard service, which really is people meeting as far as possible. I accept these days not necessarily face-to-face, it can be Zoom, that's absolutely fine. Even within Zoom, I still think it's really helpful that people can see each other's faces. You know, the dynamics of an ethics committee is really very hard. Just to wind up on that, the HRA is proposing to keep Zoom reviews at least until March of next year. But the challenge, and there's a group of people, and I'm broadly part of that, the challenge is, what do you do about bringing in new members? It's fine if you've got a group of people who know each other and the dynamics are already well known, but it's much harder. So it will be interesting to look at that for the future. But you know, I mean, broadly speaking, the online systems are helpful. Though I will just add that to get those online systems running really well, the ethics committee in the university still has to do a lot of work. Most of those off the peg online systems are only skeletons, they're only frameworks. There's a lot of work to do to actually make them work. And there's some very good examples out in the universities, I hasten to add.
David, thank you so much. That's really informative. I especially think your point about the ethics isn't an issue that you consider just at one point of the research project. I mean, my personal view, and we've talked about this a lot over the years, is that research ethics and research integrity, so good research practice, should be a feature from cradle to grave, from the moment you come up with the idea to when you write up the project, publish it, archive it, and move on to the next thing. You take your ethics and integrity brain with you. Thank you so much.